Okay, Saulo asked that I frame agrarian reform. I think I want to just start by saying this very short video I thought was very instructive, because what it shows is a logic of capital and a logic of territory. And I think that agrarian reform has always responded to these logics in one way or another. And when we say the logic of capital, we know what that is. It's about making profits. Right? And there's different ways of doing this, and it's changing over time. But when we say the logic of territory, I think it's very important to know that by the time the surveyors show up on the land, and the people who are there notice that something's going on, whether they're laying out a mine or a new agro-industrial project or some sort of extractive industry or a housing project or a tourism development, by the time the guys with the theodolites show up, capital has already begun an intense process of restructuring of that territory. And what I mean is that they change the rules, they change the institutions, they might even change the treaties. So first you may have free trade agreements. Then maybe the World Bank will loan the country money so that they can modernize their mining laws or their environmental laws, which means to remove all regulation which might impede the investment of capital and the expatriation of the profits and the wealth that might be invested. The World Bank or private industry private banks might loan money for infrastructure, because the logic of capital, what they might be interested in is either the forest or the gold or the pretty view, the palm trees, and you may have to change the roads. They might even also, the World Bank might loan money for social programs so that the people who are being displaced are recompensated in some way. The point is that capital begins to totally restructure the territory, right down to the infrastructure itself. And very often, the people who are living there don't find out until the very last minute. And by that time, all of this is in place. So the idea of a people's agrarian reform, I think, is very important. Because when we say agrarian reform rather than land reform, when we say agrarian, it means all of the rules and the institutions which surround agriculture in the countryside and rural life. It's not just the land plots themselves, because you can divide up land, but as a farmer, you would need loans, you would need markets, you would need roads, you would need a whole number of things, which also have to be reformed, because if they follow the logic of capital, you're going to lose, even if you get the land. And eventually, like the market-led land reforms of the World Bank, people get land, they aren't able to hang on to it very long, because in fact, the agrarian society is not sustainable. So I think agrarian reform is important, and when we say people's agrarian reform, we're talking not about the logic of capital, but the logic of people, the logic of livelihoods, the logic of the people of the land, wherever that land happens to be. I'll also say that historically, and I think it's still true today, that agrarian reform is always determined by two very large, or responds to two very large questions. One is the agrarian transition, and the other is the agrarian question. And as Saulo pointed out, Via Campesina has a very clear analysis on the agrarian transition, because originally the agrarian transition was, how do we get the peasants off the land? How do we move indigenous people out of the way so that we can develop industrial agriculture? And how can we take the surplus food from the peasantry? How can we take the cheap labor from the people who are there, right, and subsidize the development of industrial agriculture. And so if you look at places like the United States, you see they were quite successful in this transition in that they drove indigenous people off most of their land. They pushed the peasantry on through and then decimated small farmers, concentrating into large farms, right? To where we have only, in the United States, we have less than 2% of the population on the land, and industrialized agriculture. So very effective in terms of the capitalist transition of agriculture, using the land and using the agriculture in order to transition to a capitalist industrial agriculture. The other thing, and Via Campesina is quite clear that this is not the agrarian transition which we're looking for. The People's Agrarian Reform responds to an opposite transition, to putting people back on the land, to deindustrializing agriculture, to decommodifying nature and respecting the rights of nature and the rights of the people on the land. So it's reversing the agrarian transition, which is a huge historic, social and political, cultural project and ecological project. Because in the countries in the north, we only have 2% of the population on the land. They're not strong enough to do this. That's why this has to be a larger social project, and that's why Via Campesina has on the project of food sovereignty, which includes everyone. It's led by the people of the land. But we'd be looking for an agrarian transition which benefits all of society. The next is the agrarian question. The agrarian question is a political question that originally formulated by socialists, who also wanted to push the peasants off the land and get them into factories and get them into industrialized agriculture. So the question was, that Lenin and Kautsky asked were, how do we enroll the peasantry into a class war against the bourgeoisie and then convince them that they actually have to get off the land? That was not terribly successful. It was messy, to say the least. But the agrarian question still stands today. In other words, we can't think about a transition and we can't think about a reform without looking at political alliances. And I think that the political alliances are laid out in a very inspirational way with food sovereignty. Because with food sovereignty, we look at the leadership of indigenous people, of the peasantry, of fisher folks, of forest folks, in alliance with workers, in alliance with consumers, in alliance with urban people, so that the agrarian question is not an alliance between the peasantry and the workers to overthrow the bourgeoisie anymore. The alliance is much about the convergence of all of this diversity, all these different movements, all these different peoples, right, in order to pursue a very profound historic political question, which is a mass movement, a counter movement, building power in a different way in order to reverse the agrarian transition as it has been up to now and institute a completely different transition and a land reform which responds to this completely different way of life, which is necessary for the good of the entire planet. So I won't say any more about that. I think that we have very good testimonies here from people who are on the front lines of the agrarian reform rather than studying it myself.
Thank you, Larry.